This is the story of the building of a tradition, a story that began 50 years ago and today bears an unequaled record of service, sacrifice and progress. The story of the Royal Australian Navy. With some 12,000 miles of coastline, Australia is a continent dependent on freedom of the seas. To the west, the Indian Ocean. The tropical seas of Timor and Arafura to the north. In the east, the vast Pacific. From the Antarctic, the Great Southern Ocean. Using these seaways each year, some 40 million tons of vital cargoes flow into Australian ports from all parts of the outside world. Cargoes, most of which could not economically reach us by any other means. The influence of the sea on our early history is a matter of record, sailors and ships laying the foundation of a nation. But we were a nation largely dependent on the Royal Navy until the Australian Navy was created in 1911. In that year, the first major unit of the new fleet, HMAS Australia, was launched at Clyde. And so our Navy commenced operations with these words.
His Majesty the King has been graciously pleased to approve of the permanent naval forces of the Commonwealth being designated the Royal Australian Navy, and the ships of that Navy being designated His Majesty's Australian ships.
On the morning of October 4th, 1913, the destroyers Warrego, Parramatta and Yarra, and the cruisers Australia, Sydney and Melbourne steamed into Sydney. An infant fleet perhaps, but one soon to prove the sharpness of its teeth. 1914 and World War I. For our army, the road to Anzac. For our Navy, a baptism of fire. A baptism of fire that only 3 months after the outbreak of hostilities was to produce the most famous RAN action of the war, the destruction of the Emden. HMAS Sydney drove the enemy ashore on the Cocos Keeling Islands, and the Emden was beached and done for. Big battleships were the order of the day, and our units were engaged with them in many heroic actions. 2 submarines had been added to the Australian fleet, but both were lost. AE-2, after penetrating the Dardanelles and sinking a Turkish cruiser. Four tragic years on land and sea, where every day men of both sides fought and died. The battleship Blucher was but one of the enemy losses. Ultimately, defeat, and the end of dreams of conquest on November 11, 1918. With peace came a laying off of naval units, as one of the plans aimed at preventing future wars. Subsequently, many vessels were paid off and eventually broken up. The valiant old Sydney was among those to go, and her tripod mast was installed at Bradley's Head overlooking the harbour of her home city. In the late 20s, it became necessary to replace other obsolete vessels of the Australian fleet. A new Australia and the Canberra, 2 8-inch cruisers were commissioned. The Styles of 1928 set the scene for their arrival. One year later, another historical event. HMAS Albatross, the Navy's first plane carrier, was commissioned. It's interesting to note, however, that seaplanes had been launched from Australian ships as early as 1917. Australia had docking facilities for repairing and refitting the new ships, but only just. Even in those days, it was obvious that a bigger and better dock would have to be constructed to handle vessels up to battleship class. 1933, and the destroyers Stuart, Vampire, Voyager, Vendetta and Waterhen arrived on loan from the Royal Navy. They were to win further honours for the RAN as the Scrap Iron Flotilla. 2 years later, the arrival of a new Sydney, a modern light cruiser. Then a sister ship, the Hobart, inspected by Admiral Crace. The year 1938, and the RAN was more powerful than it had ever been. Routine training and combined exercises with the new ships were stepped up as talk of war overseas increased. But in the minds of most was the thought that it couldn't happen again. Early the following year, the nation was shocked by the death of Prime Minister Joseph Lyons. His body was returned to his birthplace by HMAS Vendetta. Among the mourners were men destined to play a big part in our future. Billy Hughes, Earl Page, John Curtin, R.G. Casey, McMahon, Harrison, McEwen. The pace of war preparedness quickened. Industrial production had had little time to adapt itself to rapidly changing conditions, but we did the best we could with what we had. And then it happened.
Warum selbst bei einem so schlechten Wetter hinausgehen, Aufzüge machen?
Europe was quickly overrun by the Nazis. RAN units were immediately directed into action, while others prepared to convoy troops to the Mediterranean. Despite the heroism of the defenders, the enemy swept through to the very shores of the English Channel. The Middle East theater developed into a savage seesaw struggle. In 1940, the Australian Scrap Iron Flotilla, so named by enemy propaganda, joined in the desperate struggle for the vital Mediterranean sea routes. Valiant actions were fought in the campaigns of Greece, Crete, Syria, and the Western Desert. Leader of the Australian destroyer flotilla, HMAS Stuart, made 24 runs on the famed Tobruk ferry service. Captain Collins commanded HMAS Sydney, also on Mediterranean service, and it was this ship which was to follow the pattern of her illustrious forebear against the more heavily armed Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni. In the early morning of July 19, 1940, off the island of Crete, Sydney engaged the Italian, and in a running fight scored several direct hits. Finished off with torpedoes, the Colleoni capsized and sank. There was natural jubilation aboard Sydney, and Captain Collins assembled his men to personally pass on congratulations.
This is a bit of the funnel that was hit by one of the shell from the Colleoni. Here I have a fragment of the shell. Just missed me.
Back home, the threat to our north had become more critical as the new cruiser Perth made her first appearance in Australian waters. Prime Minister of the day was Mr. Menzies, who with the Governor-General Lord Gowrie came aboard to watch manoeuvres. Perth later saw action in the Mediterranean before being lost in the Battle of Sunda Strait in 1942. Meanwhile, on the home front, the nation's resources were channeled to war production. Personal comforts and luxuries reduced to an austerity basis. It had become a world struggle for survival. The tribal class destroyer Arunta was one of the 74 ships built in Australia during the war. To keep pace with the growth of shipping requirements, both commercial and naval, preliminary work on the establishment of the new Captain Cook Dock was well underway, to be the largest dry dock in the Southern Hemisphere. For the first time, women were recruited to the RAN, to be known colloquially as the Rans. Then, fresh from her victory over the Italian cruiser, Sydney received a rousing welcome home. The seemingly indestructible Billy Hughes was one of the first aboard to offer official congratulations. The little digger was greeted by Admiral Crace and then proceeded to get a first-hand account from Captain Collins. There was no doubting the pride with which Sydney welcomed its heroes. The city turned on its first ticker tape welcome, but fate had a cruel twist in mind. It was not long after that a group of German prisoners picked up off Fremantle gave first clue that Sydney had been sunk with all hands. The prisoners from the raider Cormoran, which had also been sunk in the action, told of direct hits with torpedoes and gunfire. For Sydney, the fortunes of war had made her hours of glory short-lived. Then, while the Allies were suffering some of their severest setbacks in Europe, the Jap shadow spread across the Pacific, December 7th, 1941. Nearer to home, Singapore reeled and finally fell under a rain of Japanese bombardment. Still closer, Rabaul, and then Moresby. In February 1942, for the first time, war came to Australia. Target, Darwin. In the first raid, 300 people were killed, including men of the Royal Australian Navy. With the fall of the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia to become Supreme Commander Allied Forces Southwest Pacific. The growing bond of friendship towards Americans was evidenced in this welcome to the Yanks down under. On Sydney Harbour, auxiliary naval patrol boats were on duty. And despite Darwin, few civilians believed the war could come this far south. Just how wrong they were on the night of May 31st, 1942, when Japanese midget submarines penetrated our anti-sub boom. Before they were destroyed, the subs fired 2 torpedoes, missing the U.S. cruiser at which they were aimed, but hitting the depot ship Cuttable and costing the lives of 19 sailors. The salvaged remains were a stark reminder that the war was on our doorstep. Taking the battered remains of each sub, the Navy was able to assemble one to illustrate its size. Cramped quarters indeed, even for a sea cadet. Speaking of cadets, intensive training was underway at Flinders Naval Depot in Victoria, invariably under the watchful eyes of mascot Bill the Bulldog, or should we say Sea Dog. Incidentally, this group was the first to pass out of the college in wartime. All this at home, but in the Pacific the war intensified as the Allied forces began to take the offensive. These historic pictures are the last scenes taken aboard the 8-inch cruiser HMAS Canberra. Off the coast of the Solomons, in company with other units of the RAN and United States vessels, the Canberra engaged in the Battle of Savo Island. Direct hits by at least 1 torpedo and 24 shells crippled and eventually sank the gallant cruiser. A supreme contribution to ultimate victory. As success followed for the Allies, the enemy made a last fanatical attempt to stem the tide. Kamikaze. The idea was to crash an aircraft loaded with explosives into the capital ships of the advancing task forces. HMAS Australia, our veteran flagship, had built up an outstanding record in the Pacific. And during the landings in the Philippines, she was hit by no less than 5 kamikazes and had some souvenirs to prove it. It was now 1945, and the war was reaching its climax. May 7th, Germany surrendered. In the Pacific, Borneo wilted under Allied fire. I will return, MacArthur had said. He was about to fulfill that promise, and Australian ships and men played no small part in the achievement of his goal. We were back with a vengeance, a constantly mounting offensive which eventually crushed the enemy into unconditional surrender. The ceremony which officially brought the world to peace as the Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. Terrible years of incredible effort and sacrifice had won victory for the free peoples of the earth. In London, as in every other Allied city in the world, a sudden unrestrained outlet of jubilance. Leading the Australian contingent in the victory parade, men of the Royal Australian Navy. Forward 3 years to 1948, and the RAN acquired its first aircraft carrier, HMAS Sydney, as you will recall, the third capital ship of that name. Consistent with the changed pattern of warfare, the Fleet Air Arm began training at its base at Nowra, New South Wales. On a simulated flight deck, pilots trained for the real thing. Exercises carried out at sea were the next logical step, and Captain Dowling, later Vice Admiral Sir Roy Dowling, observed the progress of this young but vital adjunct to the Australian Navy. Training had its tricky moments. The outbreak of Korean hostilities in June 1950 intensified the demands on naval strength. 9 Australian ships served on operational duty, among them HMAS Bataan, proudly flying the United Nations flag. The return of fighting men from Korea was little different to the scenes witnessed after each of the 2 world wars. The family unit joyfully took up where it had left off. (1954) and the Royal Tour. It was somewhat natural that the Duke, an admiral of the fleet in the RAN, would pay a visit to Flinders. Later, the Naval College returned to Jervis Bay, where Vice Admiral Dowling and Navy Minister Gorton watched the first passing out parade of cadets. Young, well-trained men, the officers of tomorrow's Navy. Marking the end of an era in the RAN was the paying off of the valiant old flagship Australia. A sad moment as she headed for the shipbreakers. The carrier Sydney had become flagship, but a new carrier, the Melbourne, was to take over. Admiral Dowling transferred his command by crossing from one vessel to the other. But these were the RAN's yesterdays. What of today and tomorrow?